Hi Year 13, this is your lesson that you should use over your independent study period, which will follow on through to your lesson 5. In this lesson, we're going to go through again the structure of writing an exam response. We're going to explore the theme of motherhood in the texts that we've studied. And again, I'd like you to watch this video, pause at various points and make sure you're really strict with the timings of each section to make sure you're practicing writing a timed response. I'm going to go through each section of your essay. I'm going to talk through some ideas that you could explore in each section. Again, I've structured your 3 big ideas for you as you go through, and you'll need to use the notes that you made in last lesson, the tables and things like that. I'd also like you to bear in mind that our main target that we looked at from our last essays was that we need to focus more on AO2, which is how we explore the methods used by a writer. Okay, so you might like to set up for today's lesson by writing down the title of today's essay nice and clear at the top of your page so that when you come to revise, you know what you were writing about at the time. So the title, remembering that it will be slightly different from how it will be presented in the exam. In the exam, you'll have a quotation and you'll have to respond to that quotation. But I would like you to compare how the writers of the texts that you have studied present ideas about motherhood. So here we're looking at, of course, Top Girls and Feminine Gospels as a whole collection. And through this planned response, I'm going to ask you to write about 3 poems from Duffy's collection, remembering that in the exam you need to reference at least 2. So today we're looking at 3. I will tell you which poem I'd like you to explore at different parts. Okay, so we will begin by writing our introduction. We already know that we use a general specific thesis method to write our introduction. And last time you wrote an essay, your introductions were really strong and really set the tone of a comparative academic essay. So we're going to follow that same structure again. We'll begin with our general statement about the theme. Our theme is motherhood. So I would like you to write a general statement about motherhood. This could be about the presentation of motherhood in literature over time. It could be about the idea of motherhood and femininity, with motherhood being viewed as part of the female experience. So write your general statement about motherhood, spend 1 minute doing that, off you go. Okay, once you have your general statement, you're then going to write more specifically about the context of both texts. Now, generally, because Top Girls and Feminine Gospels were written only 20 years apart, the contexts can be quite similar, but I think in terms of their presentation of motherhood, both texts vary quite a lot. And that's because in the 80s, women were only just starting to change roles in society. We had the first female prime minister, and that's an interesting piece of context that you might want to introduce for Churchill. And lots of women were seemingly having to make a choice between a career and motherhood. And that was protected and supported by the legislation that was brought through prior to the 80s, things like the Abortion Act, the Free Contraceptive Pill, the Equal Opportunities Act and things like that. However, by the time Duffy was writing, things had progressed and changed quite a lot, and you had lots of women who could balance both a career and motherhood. So I would frame my introduction to the context in this way. Though written only 20 years apart, both writers were influenced by vastly different contexts. Then I would introduce the context of Top Girls in the 80s and how women's roles were just changing. And then introduce the context of Feminine Gospels and the progression that had happened in those 20 years. So I'd like you to, again, spend 2 minutes now on your specific statement. Off you go. And then finally, and this is something I think you guys have all got really good at actually, is writing your thesis statement. What is the big idea about motherhood that both writers present? We looked at this in the last lesson, so you might want to use an idea from the last lesson. And remember, it's okay when you're comparing to also draw contrasts between the two texts. So you might want to write a thesis statement about the changing women's roles with regards to motherhood. Or you might want to look at a big idea that both have in common, and we're going to develop that throughout. So spend 1 minute writing your thesis statement, off you go. So now what you should have is the title of your essay and a really strong introduction where you've already been highly comparative, where you've already introduced the theme and you've stated your thesis whilst contextualising the text. So already you'll be gaining marks in AO3 and AO1 just for your introduction. Moving on to point 1 then, and you're going to want to write your own opening statement based on the idea that I've summarised in the black box at the top. So in point 1, we're going to explore the idea that both texts present the bond between a mother, sorry, I've done a typo there, a mother and child as unbreakable. Both texts present the bond between a mother and child as unbreakable. If you want to, if you're struggling with that, you can just use that as your opening sentence. That's absolutely fine. I'd probably change texts to writers and make sure you edit out my typo there. Now, I'm going to talk you through all of the sorts of things that I would want you to include in your paragraphs at each stage. So in black, I have your AO1, your idea that will drive you. I want you, because AO2 is our focus, to find your own quotations and then explore the language. In blue, I thought about contextual factors that you could write about. And then in green, I'm encouraging you to address AO5, which is your critical interpretation, other responses and wider reading. So you might also like to find critical quotes that are short, easy to remember, to slot into this section as well. So I would begin by examining Top Girls first. In Top Girls, I think this idea of the mother-child bond being unbreakable is explored, though not as explicitly. So Marlene does leave her child. She does choose to focus on her career, but undoubtedly she masks a lot of guilt and sadness that she feels, presenting therefore her attachment to Angie being quite unbreakable. For this, you could examine the quotation about how she cries at the end, which demonstrates how, whilst her exterior seems quite hard, a bit like the Iron Lady, you could link her to Thatcher there, internally she's undoubtedly damaged and suffering in some way because of her severing of the bond between her and her child. You could look at the fact that she sends presents to Angie to assuage her guilt that she feels over leaving her. Then again, you're going to link the text to context. Again, you could bring in Margaret Thatcher and the fact that Marlene seems to be modelled on Thatcher, the idea that women were just gaining some power in the workplace through that legislation. But ultimately, the idea that is presented to us here is that although Marlene chooses to chase a career rather than motherhood, she can't escape the guilt that she feels, and therefore that bond between mother and child seems to be presented as something unbreakable. You might also like to talk about, haven't included it there, the fact that Churchill was her mother herself. You're then going to compare it to Duffy. I want you to write about Cord in this particular section of the poem, because I think there's lots that we could do in terms of the exploring the methods used by Duffy. So I want you to write about the universal imagery of stars, how stars carry connotations of guidance, navigation, something that's always there, so presence. To demonstrate how Duffy, no matter how old Ella grows, is always that guiding light. You can also talk about how stars link in with light imagery, as we've explored as a universal metaphor as well, and what that demonstrates. You could look at the form of the poem, and this is something that previously we haven't written too much about, so I'd like you to have a go at that. Talk about how the enjambment creates a sense of Duffy's relationship with Ella, and how the continuation of the lines between each stanza, demonstrates that fact that their relationship continues even as Ella grows and becomes more independent. You could look at the imagery associated with the chord itself and how initially mother and child are physically attached, but then the emotional attachment, you could argue, is just as strong. In terms of context, you want to be looking at Duffy's relationship with Ella. The fact that Ella is her daughter, in fact, would be context in itself. And then I want you to think about wider reading. What would a feminist say about the role of a mother in a woman's life? So you should spend 15 minutes writing this. There are some ideas on the screen. You want to bring in ideas of your own. Remember that as well as your AO3, your AO5 and your AO4, you want to be exploring methods to score highly for AO2 as well. Set a timer for 15 minutes and write your point 1. Off you go. Okay, I look forward to reading those and seeing what you come up with, and hopefully we have that clear focus on AO2 as you go through. Point 2 then. So I think another big idea in terms of motherhood that both writers explore is the idea of the growing pressure on women as they work and parent in the modern world. Remember that this paper is called Modern Times, so they absolutely want you to ground your response in the time in which the texts were written. And I want you to think about this before you write your response. So attitudes towards women in the workplace undoubtedly have changed by the time these texts have written. Women now can gain more power in the workplace. Women are more accepted within the workplace. But previously a woman's role was to look after children, feed their families, etc. Have there been any changes in attitudes to a woman's domestic role? Has that altered? Do women share the domestic role with men, or are they expected to balance an entire responsibility for domestic life with a career? And that's something I want you to think about, because I do think that Churchill definitely shows that, and I do think that idea is explored in work as well, how because Marlene has to make the choice that she has to sacrifice all relationships in her life. Seemingly, if she were to choose to be a mother as well, she would have to take on all domestic responsibility as well as balancing. Think about the presentation of men in Top Girls. Whilst there's no male characters, men are alluded to, and generally they're alluded to as being devoid of that kind of responsibility for domestic life. Joyce's husband leaves her to raise the child, just doesn't treat Mrs. Kidd particularly nicely. And so it seems that women have to take on all domestic responsibilities as well as balancing a career as well. In Top Girls, you could look at the section of the text where all of the women in the office talk about their relationships and how they sacrificed relationships. You could talk about the women in Act 1 as well, to show how Churchill demonstrates that whilst things have vastly changed, there are some things that remain the same, this idea that it's always the woman that has to sacrifice and suffer in some way. You could even look at Mrs. Kidd and the dichotomy created between her and Marlene. In terms of context, you'll want to be looking at the legislation protecting women in the workplace and introducing that. You want to talk about how Churchill didn't want to be labelled as a feminist. And so she doesn't necessarily think that these new women's roles are entirely liberating. She also thinks that they're limiting in some way as well. After you've written about Top Girls, I want you to be writing about Duffy's poem Work, which explores how the modern world puts increasing pressure on women. So at the beginning of the poem, you have a woman in the domestic sphere, which is a representation of women in the past, whose role would have been grounded within the domestic sphere, feeding her family and working at home. You then have a woman who has to feed an increasingly big family while also balancing jobs, and that demonstrates how women's roles have changed through time, but how this has just increased pressure upon a woman. She has to take on all of the domestic role of feeding the children, nurturing the children, whilst also balancing all of her changing roles throughout time. So you can look in terms of context at how women's roles have changed in Duffy's time. You can look at the changing spheres that women work within. And you can also look at Duffy's own success in her career that was balanced with her own experience as a mother. So she was a mother to Ella, but still achieved great success as the first female poet laureate. In terms of wider reading and other interpretations, you could perform a structuralist reading where you explore the dichotomy between Mrs. Kidd and Marlene and how both of them allow us to examine the two very different roles for women in society. But overall, the big idea here is that there's growing pressure on women in the modern world as they're expected to work and also be a mother. There was a meme actually circulated on social media a while back that I remember that says that women are expected to work like they're not parents and parent like they don't work. I think that's quite a poignant point for this section of your essay. 15 minutes then, please do set a timer, off you go. Okay, so sorry, it should say point 3, again another typo. Churchill demonstrates that women have to make a choice between motherhood and a career, whereas Duffy demonstrates that a woman can successfully balance both. Remember that I said it is perfectly fine to contrast the texts as well as compare them. And I do think that the 20 years difference in the times that they were written had a big impact on the ideas that they present, because I do think Churchill presents that women in the 80s did have to make that choice. And that's demonstrated through Marlene and Joyce. Both of them make very different choices and both of them suffer in some way as a result. Marlene chooses to be the career woman, and as a result she feels sadness and guilt and isolation. Joyce chooses to be a mother and feels a sense of entrapment. And a good section to explore that would be in Act 3, where they talk about them and us, to demonstrate the difference between them and the growing difference. While they both come from the same background, their paths have taken a really different turn because of the choices that they've had to make. Here, I think it's a good point to introduce Top Girls as a work of postmodernism, remembering that postmodernism seeks to raise questions rather than answer them. Again, you could link into the idea of Marlene being quite a fragmented character. You can look at the non-chronological order that allows us to see Marlene as a successful career woman, and then at the end reveal the sadness in the decisions that she's had to make. For this particular point, I would like you to explore Duffy's poem Sub. So in Sub, the particular section that I want you to be looking at is where she has the child. And whilst pregnancy isn't in any way limiting for the narrator, motherhood does create a pause in her success. So you could examine the quotation where she talks about how motherhood kept her busy at home and how her role temporarily changed. However, Duffy conveys a different idea to Churchill, because whilst motherhood meant that Joyce could never chase a career, in Duffy's poem, she presents that motherhood pauses the career, but she can quickly adapt and return to a successful career when she agrees on a whim to slim. Again, thinking about your methods there, you want to look at the internal rhyme between whim to slim. You want to be looking at the connotations of whim, how it's not a big, huge decision that she has to make to re-enter the working world. 15 minutes then to write up your ideas. Off you go. Finally then, our conclusion will take the following structure. We'll have an overall sentence and a therefore sentence. In your overall sentence, you want to be summarising the big ideas about motherhood. Okay, overall, both writers present, or you might like to revisit the idea that they were written 20 years apart and that had a big impact on the big ideas that they convey to the reader. And then in your therefore sentence, you're going to think back to your thesis and you're going to reread your thesis and you're going to answer your thesis statement and finish on your big point that you made at the start. Okay, please remember to submit your work. I'm happy to accept typed documents. They're quite easy for me to edit as well, actually, because I can just send you back my comments, or photographs of written work is fine as well. Submit it through Show My Homework, and I look forward to seeing your exam responses because they have been really high quality, so well done.